Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, we're going to address a topic that many of us find overwhelming and often paralyzing: climate change, which is creating a global mental health crisis due to both direct effects like extreme heat, hurricanes, fires, floods, desertification, and displacement, and due to indirect effects like knowledge and awareness of the crisis. People all over the world are experiencing climate mental health issues, including climate trauma, climate anxiety, and climate grief. In fact, 8 out of every 10, or 83% of Gen Zers in the U.S. worry about climate change, and 75% of that group said the environment affects their mental health. A recent global survey across 10 countries of over 10,000 youth ages 16 to 25 illustrates the depth of anxiety and distress many young people are feeling about climate change. 75% of those youth surveyed said they thought the future was frightening, and over half said that they think humanity is doomed. Clearly, this is a growing mental health problem for our youth, and in turn for every one of us, that needs to be recognized, discussed, and aggressively addressed. So in that spirit, today we're joined by Chloe Rosen, a Gen Zer in their mid-20s, and Paula Wild, a Millennial in her late 30s. We'll be hearing about the impact climate change has had on their mental health and how they are finding ways to cope and take action in their own lives. Our hope is that this show might help you to find ways to process the immensity of the climate change problem while maintaining your own mental health in order to productively respond to the crisis in front of us. Let me tell you more about our guests. Chloe Rosen is a queer, non-binary 26-year-old who's been living in Santa Cruz, California for the last 8 years. They studied psychology and dance and graduated from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 2018. They are an outdoor educator for kids aged kindergarten to 5th grade, a professional dance artist, and a yoga and dance teacher. They are committed to a life of practicing vulnerable authenticity, collective healing, and presence. Chloe's movement and spiritual practices are deeply connected to the earth. They feel immense weight and devastation when thinking about the sickness of the planet and all the pain humans have inflicted on each other and the earth. Yet they are also invigorated to reach towards change and healing. Chloe believes that openly talking about and making art exploring the realities of our current circumstances and the effects they have on our mental health to be invaluable ways to catalyze change. Also with us is Paula Wild, who's been offering trauma-informed yoga workshops from a perspective of accessibility and inclusion for over a decade. She holds over 1,000 hours of yoga teacher training certifications and became a certified yoga therapist in 2015. Paula is inspired and driven by the connections between adventure, wilderness travel, the practice of yoga and mindfulness, and design of sustainable livelihoods. She believes that the tools yoga and time in nature offer are the most effective ways to connect with our own inner wisdom and expand our potential in the world. Paula also holds a master's degree in International Agricultural Development from UC Davis, a certificate in permaculture design, and has studied extensively with Joanna Macy in The Work That Reconnects in order to help people discover and experience their innate connections with each other and the self-healing powers of the web of life, in order to transform despair and overwhelm into inspired, collaborative action. Welcome, Chloe and Paula, to State of Mind. Thank you both for being here. And where are you joining us from today?
Yeah, hi, I am Chloe and I'm joining from the west side of Santa Cruz. which is on the unceded territory of the Aswas speaking UB tribe.
And Paula?
Hi, thank you so much, Deborah. I am joining this morning from one of the oldest and most diverse temperate hardwood forests in the world, and also one of the newest national parks in the United States, the New River Gorge here in West Virginia. And it's a place that's new for me. Very, very grateful to be here. And it is on the unceded territories of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, Tutelo, Monotone, and Saatsoya people.
Thank you. So I was thinking we could get started, Paula, with you. If you could help define for us what climate or eco anxiety or grief is, and what are the common symptoms or expressions that you see of this, and how prevalent or common is this experience?
Thank you, Deborah. I'm so grateful you've welcomed us here to talk about this topic because it's relatively new in the field of psychology, and yet it's something that we are all absolutely living each and every day. So the American Psychology Association describes eco-anxiety, that's one term, as the chronic fear of environmental cataclysm that comes from observing the seemingly irrevocable impact of climate change and the associated concern for one's future and that of next generations. So eco-anxiety is something that's relatively new in terms of us talking about it, right? And yet it's something that has been present for quite some time. Another term I want to bring up here that we might have heard in this context is solastalgia, and that's a term that was coined in 2005. So solastalgia is anxiety, despair, and or trauma that's experienced by folks whose homes, land, or community has been directly impacted by environmental degradation or climate change, whether human caused or not. So the difference between solastalgia and eco-anxiety is solastalgia is when you're right there, you're witnessing it and it's happening to you in a sense, or that might be the perception you have, right? That this horrible thing is happening to you and to your home. Whereas eco-anxiety is the possibility of, right? It is looking into the future and the anxiety that comes from that. So because these are relatively new concepts, we don't really have a lot of medical data around them yet. So not very large sample sizes in terms of studies. However, one way in which we can think a little bit about this, there's a wonderful study, the study on adverse childhood experiences and how those later affect our choices as adults, right?
And our mental and physical health.
Exactly. And ultimately our health and well-being through those choices. Yes. And so we can think a little bit about, any of the symptoms that I'm about to describe of mental health impacts of climate change a little bit like one of the ACEs, right? Like that can be considered an adverse childhood experience. So if it functions in the same manner, then we do have some robust data there. So you asked about common symptoms or expressions for climate or eco-anxiety. So these can vary and they range from acute to chronic. So following disasters, major changes, damages to social or community infrastructure, you're going to have more acute symptoms. So that could look like PTSD, it could look like aggression or violence. It could look like disrupted sleep, disrupted eating patterns, etc. In contrast, when we have more gradual impacts of climate change, right? So weather weirding, right? Things that are just changing, the constant conversation in the news, right? Or lack of connected conversations on the topic. So these sort of more insidious, more daily things are going to lead to often more chronic type symptoms. So definitely anxiety, depression, and can get as severe as suicidal ideation and suicide. Absolutely. So it's a really broad range. And at this time, neither solastalgia nor eco-anxiety have been categorized, in the DSM as a disorder per se. But I think that I'm so glad we're talking about it, because it is certainly a ubiquitous experience, I think.
Even I know as you're talking, I'm thinking about the local impacts. We had huge fires here a few years ago. So many people experience what you said, like that acute sense. And then I know that as I drive around town and look at the redwoods here browning around the edges, I feel this incredible sadness about seeing this change happening right before my eyes. And I'm sure a lot of people locally have had that kind of experience too, watching the changes.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Chloe, we invited you on the show today to share your experience of growing up with climate change awareness and fear, and how that's been impacting your life and your mental health. So when did you first become aware of climate change, and how would you describe that initial impact on you?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. So, what I can trace back to being my first introduction to climate change was probably in seventh grade earth sciences. I remember learning about it in a context that was like very lighthearted, this is happening. And, if we reduce, reuse, recycle, and drive our cars less and take shorter showers, we have the power to stop this. And of course, that was decades ago, or a decade or so ago or more. And things have gotten increasingly more serious. But at that point, as a 12-year-old, I sincerely thought that I, as an individual, had immense power to make a change. And one of our projects in seventh grade was to write songs, activist songs about how to do our part. And that is a stark memory in my brain. I made a music video, and I think some of the lyrics were, greenhouse gases are bad, they make the earth feel sad. That's pretty much the only lines I remember, but
Well, I can relate to that. I think we've all been through a phase of feeling like that we could personally make a huge difference. So how and when did your awareness and anxiety about climate grow and change over time? And what were the mental health impacts as that awareness grew?
yeah, so seeing it in real time. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And my grandmother, who lived in the Porter Ranch Mountains, was evacuated more than twice. Also, I lived in a house growing up where the news was on all the time, often during dinner. So just seeing it before my eyes, the bright red flames on the sides of the freeways that I drove on with my family every day, and, just seeing it constantly happening in my neighborhood and to people that I loved, I started having chronic recurring nightmares about wildfires and natural disasters in general. And that definitely played into my insomnia and anxiety and depression that I now can trace back to, it's multifaceted and lots of things play into it, but that's climate anxiety is definitely a big part of it.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD Santa Cruz. K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're talking with outdoor educator and dance artist Chloe Rosen about how climate change has impacted their mental health and how they are finding ways to cope and address the issue in their life and their work. Also with us is yoga therapist and instructor and outdoor educator Paula Wild, who's sharing about the impacts of climate change on her life and offering some healing approaches that can help us address the global mental health crisis being caused by climate change. Stay with us and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. Coming back from the break, I want to come back to you, Chloe, because I want to ask about what role do you think climate change plays in your mental health today?
Yeah. So mental health wise, I feel this, like I said, hopelessness, and I can trace it back to a particular memory. A couple summers ago, I remember sleeping and the lightning storms, which were one of the catalysts for the CZU lightning complex fires, startling me awake. I remember having a 6 a.m. shift the next morning for the farmers market and laying in bed all night, just hearing those huge, thunderous lightning thunder and just feeling the sense of, oh my God, like what is going to come of this, sort of like this intuitive sense of doom that was about to occur. And I remember at like 5 a.m., one of my coworkers texted the farmers market manager saying like, hey, I don't think it's super safe for us to go set up tents in an open parking lot during a lightning storm. I'm going to sit this one out and stay home. And I really appreciated my coworkers' sense of asserting their own boundaries for their own safety. I was met with, from my farmers market manager, sort of just like, oh, like we need you here. Now that they're not coming, we need somebody to come. We need somebody to hold it down. I felt like I wasn't given space to take care of myself. And then later on, when the fires were raging, the air quality was horrendous. This was also in the beginning of the pandemic, and again, as someone with asthma, I did not feel comfortable working outside for 7 hours in the air quality. And similarly, I spoke my needs and I was met with sort of like, oh, like we cannot miss this farmer's market. Like we need you there. I was given an N95 and just told to, show up and continue. So I think that all of this just is a stark reality check that, capitalism does not stop. And that's part of the reason why climate change is catalyzing to the extent that it is, because we prioritize work and we prioritize capitalism. So that realization just made me feel really helpless. And like, if I want to be successful, whatever that means in this world, I have to prioritize that and sort of shut away the reality that climate change has on my mental health and physical health.
Yeah, and for people that might not be from this area, it would be hard to imagine how strange the air was during that time. It was like the color brown. Paula, that's a good lead in because we invited you here to talk about your work, but I also know that you personally have been impacted by climate change. So would you share some of how you've been affected?
Sure. So I had the great privilege and honor of purchasing some property in Mariposa County in California, right outside of Yosemite National Park, back in 2014. And I was a steward there for 5.5 years. And in that period of time, I was really a witness to a story unfolding. And when I arrived there on that property, on that territory, it was mixed conifer, mostly ponderosa pine, sugar pine, cedar forest. And in the time that I resided there and did my very best to support the forest management of that 5.5 acre piece of land on our earth, I'd say 95% of the coniferous trees died due to the bark beetle epidemic, if you will, if you want to call it that. and I witnessed the land change from a pine forest to an oak woodland. So in 5 years, I witnessed an ecosystem change, and it was terrifying and magical and amazing and beautiful and so scary. And the backstory there, the context is in California's Sierra Nevada, the western pine beetle. It's a native there. Like, this is totally a natural cycle, right? Totally a natural cycle. However, drought makes it more challenging for the trees to have their natural defense mechanism of creating more sap. So that's an issue. It has been an issue for trees in drought years. However, these infestations, they're being amped up even more by global warming, and they're found to kill about 30% more trees than in drought alone. And so that's because the bark beetles, the more of them are hatching, right? Because we don't have cool enough temperatures in the winter to kill off the swarm. We're having more insect pressure, right? So it's this double whammy on the trees. And we've lost about 102 million trees in California, like in the last decade.
Just a bark beetle, not even
Yes.
counting the fires.
Yes, exactly. And so then that's, of course, increased fuel load for the fires. So these issues are so complex and so layered, right? And so that's an aspect of the mental health piece too, is how are we to wrap our minds around this, right? Do I need to be an expert on, A, B, C? I mean, I don't know. I do think it helps to educate ourselves about our local issues.
Chloe, I want to turn to you because I understand you work in outdoor education with kids. And I'm wondering if you can describe that work and what role does climate change awareness and anxiety play in the work you do with kids?
Yeah, well, encouraging right relationship with the planet, specifically by learning from Indigenous stewardship, is the basis of what I and the other teachers at Kids in Nature teach the kids. And part of that, there's so many layers, but primarily I feel with kids, I find like the entitlement to Earth's resources is something that is prominent from a very, very early age, just, ripping things out of the dirt and claiming it as their own. So one of the biggest things I try to teach is mindful harvesting and planting the seed into kids' brains that they are not entitled to just take from the earth. The earth just keeps on giving, and that is a beautiful part of living on this planet. But if we just take and don't give anything in return, that is not going to be good for us or our planet. So I had this one teacher mentor, her name's Melody Overstreet, and she said something really potent to me during an ethnobotany training last summer. She said that it's important to teach the idea of mindful harvesting to children by saying, if you take something from the earth, maybe think about, like, if you take a plant off a tree or off of out of the ground, maybe you pluck a hair out of your head and leave it there for the plant, for the earth. That act of like reciprocity of reckoning with the idea that, yes, I am taking something from the earth, but I am also taking something from my own body. Like, how do we know that plants, that trees do not feel pain? I hear kids say that all the time. Oh, well, it's a tree. It's a tree, it's a plant. It doesn't matter. And I like to change that idea by primarily not referring to living beings as it. And this is talked about a lot in Braiding Sweetgrass as well. Living beings are living beings. So referring to them, as like this creature, also breaks the barrier, the idea that we are separate from the land that we inhabit.
So knowing how you felt as a child, Chloe, how do you try to address specifically climate change with the kids you work with? Like, are there approaches that you take because you wish someone had done something different with you when you were a child?
Yeah, I think just showing up to the job as a human and not separating myself from the issue. I think that was a big thing in seventh grade. My teacher didn't really seem scared, or she didn't really seem very emotive about the idea of climate change in general. So just showing up to work and expressing my true feelings, being vulnerable with the kids. It wasn't last summer, it was, I think a couple years ago, it was during the CCU Lightning Complex fires. It was the first day of program, and it was 4 p.m. and dark out. And all of my students, I think I had a group of kindergartners that day. Most of them were crying. Just, what is going on? We were outside in Pogonip hiking, and they were afraid to go. They were afraid to walk. They were afraid to be in nature with this strange orange hue. Why was it dark in the afternoon? They were confused, disoriented. They weren't sure what was going on. And I remember feeling extremely, extremely odd and like just horrible to see right in front of my eyes the ways in which it was affecting my students and myself, So in that moment, I was just like, I know, everybody, I'm feeling really, really unsure about what's going on too. There are fires happening, just leveling with them, getting on their level and saying, I am here with you. I am experiencing this with you. I'm feeling the pain of this with you. And how can we feel that together while also co-regulating? So if I learned anything from the ways in which climate change was introduced to me, it was what I can do differently. And I think offering children resources to cope and to regulate are immensely, immensely important. That piece of the puzzle cannot be left out. We need to be able to regulate ourselves and our communities through healing practices in order to do anything, or else we're just going to feel immobilized.
Well, I'm so glad you're leading us right into the next question I want to ask you, which was about, so what coping strategies do you personally use to manage your own climate anxiety and grief and the sense of overwhelm that you can be drawn into feeling about it?
Yeah, a whole bunch of things, primarily movement practices. I am a dancer and a yoga practitioner, student and teacher. So my movement practices, particularly yoga and my spiritual improvisational dance practice, is so vital in feeling connected with the earth. Practicing outside, dancing barefoot on the dirt, being immersed in nature. It's strange that we even have a word for nature, right? Because there's no separation. Being outside and just connecting to the beauty and letting it invigorate my movement. And, that is primarily my tool that I use. It's really important for me to feel connection with my body because, like I said, there is no separation from my body and the earth. So,
and what are some of the coping skills for regulation you try to help the kids learn that you work with?
Yeah, with the kids, we teach a lot about breathing practices. So in traditional yogic lineage, pranayama, breathing practices which help the nervous system go from the fight, flight, freeze mode into a rest and digest state by doing equal breathing or longer exhales to ground them. I think it's so important for kids, even, at age 5, to be able to learn how to regulate their nervous systems by just breathing, by just noticing what's going on, and then using the tools of movement and breathing to help themselves.
So at one point you mentioned when I was talking to you about coming on the show, you talked about this concept called vicarious resilience. I'm wondering if you can just briefly say like what that is and where that concept comes from.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly where it is coined, but I read about it in a book that has been a lifeline for me this year called Queer Dharma, Yoga and Meditation for Queer Liberation by Jacob B. Ballard. And that book is all about, it goes deep into the pain and oppression of being a queer, marginalized person, of struggles that BIPOC face, and gives us tools for working through that. And the book talks about how vicarious trauma is prominent in oppressed communities. So the commonality of, oh, we've both been through this pain, we both experienced this oppression, we have similar trauma. So vicarious trauma paves the way for vicarious resilience, seeing people in your communities who have been through really horrible things in the context of climate change, seeing people that are living with it and finding ways to cope and to invigorate and make small choices that ripple out into patterns for creating larger change. So vicarious resilience is seeing other people in similar painful situations, seeing them coping and healing and working and feeling invigorated by that.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-SQUID, Community Radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. You can find the podcasts of all our shows on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and on the KSQD website or your home smart speaker. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're hearing from our guest, outdoor educator and dance artist Chloe Rosen, about the impact climate change has had on their mental health. And they're also sharing how they are finding ways to cope and address the issue in their life and work. We're also being joined by yoga therapist and outdoor educator Paula Wild, who's sharing with us some healing approaches that she uses to help her students process and address the often overwhelming and paralyzing problem of climate change. I want to remind listeners that every State of Mind episode has a resource list posted along with the show, and the resources we talk about today can be found on the post for this show at ksqd.org/state of mind. Now, back to our interview. So coming back from the break, Paula, what about you? What specific coping strategies do you personally use to manage your own climate change anxiety and fears?
Well, I love that we're talking about vicarious resilience, because I would say that's probably the first one in terms of strategies. So connection, right? To remember my connection to everyone, everything, and to actively do that. So I can connect with authors through reading, right? I can connect with colleagues through working together on, say, a climate initiative. I could connect with my family around the dinner table by prompting a conversation. We can have this conversation now. And then ultimately I can connect with the natural world. I loved the strategies that Chloe shared, 100% on board with all of those. I think that taking that time to just go stand outside barefoot for a few minutes, right? Just keep honoring your connection and keep remembering your connection, right? An active remembrance, actively remembering it every day, moment to moment. Another coping strategy that I really appreciate is choosing a point of view, because the point of view that we hold, the story that we believe in, is going to have a pretty big impact on how we behave in the world. So a point of view that I find very, very helpful in the context of climate change and my relationship to it stems from Buddhism and systems theory, and specifically looks at the concept of impermanence, right? So while the structure that I live in is ultimately impermanent, right? Over thousands and thousands of years. Let's say my home structure is ultimately impermanent. It is a different feeling when it big floods come in and take it out, or a wildfire comes and destroys it. It's a different kind of impermanence, and yet having some of those points of view well established can really help you in those moments.
You also have mentioned to me that you are a yoga therapist, and I'm wondering if yoga therapy plays a role in how you cope or how you help other people cope with addressing climate change and the impacts of it.
Sure. Well, I love Chloe spoke to emotional regulation and generally nervous system regulation. So yoga and all of the practices associated with it, both the physical practices, the breath work practices, the mindfulness or meditation practices associated with it can support that nervous system regulation. So it may not have a specific direct line, but in that general sense, yes.
Which increases our resilience and our ability to respond to challenging times in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to mention to listeners that we also did a whole show on healing the body and mind with yoga therapy. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, check out episode 39. We also talked a lot about nervous system regulation in the two-part series we recently produced on building resilience. What is your soul food? And those are episodes 42 and 43, and people might want to also check out those. So, Paula, I understand you've also studied this particular approach called the work that reconnects, that consists of activities that support people in coping with really big and overwhelming issues like climate change. Can you describe what that work is and what the origins of it are?
My pleasure. So I thankfully found the work that reconnects in 2015 when I was experiencing the situation with the bark beetle and evacuating that house also every summer for wildfires. We evacuated every single summer I lived there. So I really resonate with that. So I'm so grateful I found Joanna Macy and the work that reconnects. What it is, excuse me, what it is a form of group work designed to enliven and strengthen us to take part in the healing of our world. Those are Joanna's words. And so this began in the 1970s in response to the growing use of nuclear power and a recognition that as a species, right, as humanity, we were doing something different. We were leaving a legacy for generations deep into the future, right? A radioactive legacy. It was like, wow, this is different. We're having this really long arc of an impact, and we need to recognize that. So that's where it first sort of began. And the work that reconnects, basically the beauty of it is that it connects us with our natural intelligence, with each other, and then ultimately with all beings on the planet. And so there's a whole lot of resource there, right? It's not all up to just you. It's so great, right? So by doing this work, by doing these activities, it's like a practice, just like yoga is a practice. You get on the mat, even if you don't feel like it some days, because ultimately you just show up again and again, and it has these subtle and beautiful and long-term positive benefits and effects.
So, Paula, I just want to come back to you. You were telling us about the work that reconnects, and I'm wondering if you could give us some examples of how you use this work and what impact you see it having on those you share it with.
Sure. So the work that reconnects is based on a framework of a spiral. And there are these 4 stages in the spiral. You can consider them fractal. So you can go through these 4 stages on any one particular topic. So let's say a wildfire, or a particular conversation you had with someone, or over the course of a year, a decade, a lifetime. So that it's quite flexible. So the first stage is gratitude. And gratitude quiets the mind, brings us back to a space of our source. Chloe mentioned earlier Indigenous knowledge and I believe traditional ecological knowledge. And if we look at Indigenous cultures throughout the world, everyone starts everything with gratitude always. Right? So it's a very good place to start because it cracks us open, it breaks us open, right? And there are ways, so here's an example. There are ways to access gratitude without saying to someone, what are you grateful for? Write in your gratitude journal. Sometimes when we're feeling crummy, we don't feel like writing in our gratitude journal, right? Like it's hard to do. So coming at it from a different angle, from asking people about what they love, for example, right? So in the work that reconnects, one activity is sharing with somebody and speaking for 5 straight minutes about some things I love about being alive in Earth are, right? So if you think about that for a moment, what are some things you love about being alive in Earth? That just starts to soften folks and crack us open so that we can then go to the next stage, which is honoring our pain for the world, right? So that's an essential part of being able to take action is knowing that we care. Thich Nhat Hanh was asked, what is the best thing that we can do for our planet right now? And the response was, it is to feel the planet crying within us. So as we're able to honor our pain and be witnessed in that and share that with others, we begin to see with new eyes. We begin to see our connections across species and across time, right, with past and future generations. As that becomes more and more part of our daily consciousness, this recognition that perhaps we have a responsibility to those coming in the future, right? As that becomes part of our daily consciousness, you can't help but want to act. You can't help but do things, whether it be, Deborah doing this radio show, right? Because that's where she's going to make an inroad, to make change in the world, right? So we can't help but act. And so the fourth stage is going forth, right? So equipped with this new perspective, we're able to go forth into actions that call us to participate in the healing of our world. So again, this can happen quickly. This can happen over the course of a lifetime. But I have just witnessed people break open and move through some really big obstacles, big internal psychological hurdles, and free up their bodies, minds, and spirits to act with such incredible power as advocates for our planet.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and we're talking today with outdoor educator and dance artist Chloe Rosen about how climate change has impacted their mental health and how they are having to find ways to cope and address the issue in their life and work. Also with us is yoga therapist and instructor and outdoor educator Paula Wild, who's sharing some healing approaches that can help us address the global mental health crisis caused by climate change. Both guests are also sharing resources that they use to help them cope and take action in order to be part of the solution. So stay with us and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Climate Mental Health Network for supporting State of Mind. Climate Health Network addresses the mental health consequences of climate change through community engagement and by harnessing the power of media and technology. More information at climatementalhealth.net. Thank you, Climate Mental Health Network, for supporting community radio K-Squid 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. As we're coming to the end of our time together, I think I'm going to focus us in on the fact that both of you have spent a lot of time thinking about climate change, and what I've really learned from doing this radio show is there is nothing as powerful as lived wisdom. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that, as you think about what you've learned along your own journey, is there anything that you wish you had known earlier in your awareness about climate change and the impact it would have on you and those around you?
Yes, absolutely, Deborah. First and foremost, how real it is. It's really real. Like growing up for me, that I'm 39 now, that wasn't so clear. Secondly, how to resource myself from the inside and the outside to be more resilient in relating to the change, right? Because things are changing and we can be more resilient. It's a choice. There are a lot of resources. And then finally, I just wanted to share when I met a young colleague in this field, who I definitely would call a climate activist, in their very early 20s. This was a handful of years ago. And I was so inspired by this person's creativity and commitment. And I just hope that we're, I feel like I'm equipping myself now, but anytime I get to share time with younger people to support them in equipping themselves, so that they can just tap right into their power more quickly, more directly.
Thank you. I'm glad you spoke to that, because that really speaks to the importance of the work that Chloe is doing by helping influence young minds and opening them up to that awareness. Yeah. What about you, Chloe? Is there anything you wish you had known earlier in your own awareness about climate change and the impact it would have on you and those around you?
Yeah, I guess starting with the more heavy realities, that capitalism is intrinsically connected to climate change, and just learning the interconnectedness of climate change and capitalism, and specifically how disproportionately climate change affects oppressed communities of color. I don't think we talk about that enough. Um, and I think talking about it again is the starting point, the jumping off point. Just saying these realities out into the ether, connecting with other humans about these realities is the first step. We cannot make change if we are disembodied. And disembodiment is part of that, is just not connecting with the true feelings that arise in us. In terms of the more, I guess, positive resilience building, resilience training mechanisms, I said earlier, I wish I was given tools to regulate and to cope with the heaviness of those realities. I found them eventually on my own later on, but I think if we give children these tools as early as possible, there's just more hope.
Thank you. I know that both of you came really equipped with some important resources that you also want to share, that would help people with resilience, healing, and hope. And so along those lines, I wonder if you would like to share a few of those with our listeners. And I want to remind listeners that there also will be more resources on the resource list than we'll have time to talk about today. So Paula, are there any specific resources you'd like to recommend for our listeners?
Yes, I recommend folks check out the workthatreconnects.org. It's workthatreconnects.org. And there's a wonderful compilation of articles, audiobooks, poetry, practices, songs, music, training videos there. Best is going and working with folks in person. There's also a wonderful podcast called For the Wild. Very inspiring podcast community sharing stories of truth and hope around our planet, to help connect and inspire us in challenging times. So that's just a couple that I'll uplift right here, and then we'll have a lot more online.
Thank you. What about you, Chloe? Are there specific resources you would like to share?
Yeah, in the resource list, I included one of my favorite authors, artists, poets, Adrienne Maree Brown's, her blog. And in particular, you can find all the information there on her website. Her book called Emergent Strategy has been particularly inspiring. It's a nonfiction that draws links between the systems in nature like mycelium, ants, ferns, and birds. And she uses that to paint a model in which to base our social justice work. So the idea that multiplicities of seemingly small acts, they have the power to ripple out and create complex systems and patterns for change. Another one that I mentioned earlier is Queer Dharma, Yoga and Meditations for Liberation, by Jacob B. Ballard. It's been really important for me as a queer person to read about how we can hold all of this pain, not specifically about climate change, but there's no separation. It's there, it's touched upon, and how we can heal and cope together. So, and then the third I also mentioned earlier is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it speaks about the relationship with the earth in a way that I've truly never experienced before. Just really hones in the idea that there is no separation between us and earth.
Beautiful, thank you. So as we wrap up here, I just wonder if there's any final thoughts that you would like to leave listeners with, Paula.
Yes, if you feel anxiety around climate change, you're not alone. And thank you for feeling and for caring. As long as we're out of alignment, which we are as a species with the earth, we may feel out of alignment with ourselves. As Chloe just said, we are the earth. So by living in alignment with your values and seeking spaces of shared support and grief, we may be able to ease some of this natural tension and find ourselves more resourced to act on behalf of ourselves and our planet.
Thank you. What about you, Chloe? Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave listeners with?
Yeah, Paula said it beautifully. Mine are quite similar. Climate anxiety is real. Climate anxiety means that you are feeling, and we need to open ourselves up to feeling in order to make a change. Capitalism disembodies us. Reckoning with this idea and noticing how this disembodiment distances us from the planet that we are not just walking on, but of, And the last little point that I'll make is that feeling into our pain is radical. Feeling into our pain and sharing it with others is the first step in healing our planet. And vicarious resilience cannot exist without sharing vicarious trauma.
In Your Voice are short segments where our listeners get to add their voice to the discussion. You can either call in and leave a message or record an audio file right on your phone. Either way, tell us about your mental health experience relating to the topic, share something that's contributed to your mental health recovery, or share a resource that really helped you. Submission details can be found at ksqd.org/state of mind. Next up, we hear from a listener from the baby boomer generation who shares about the impact climate change has had on his life.
Hello, my name is David. I'm a 69-year-old retired district ranger who had a 36-year career in preservation and management of open space lands. I would like to share my story regarding my extreme anxiety over climate change. During my senior year at high school in 1970, I first heard through the school science instructor about the concept of climate change. At the time, science showed the urgency of the issue, stating humans have approximately 20 years to substantially reduce carbon output in order to avoid irreparable damage to the planet through atmospheric warming. During the following 20 to 30 years, scientists, corporations, and politicians generally were in agreement that atmospheric warming was a problem. However, not a lot was done to address it. In the late 1990s, opinions began to change. First, corporations, primarily the oil industry, began to change their stance and spent the next 15 years presenting pseudoscience theories claiming climate change was not occurring as a result of human activity. Their new mantra became climate change is a natural and continuous occurrence on the earth based in historic climate studies going back thousands of years. They claim this is a natural process that humans had no control over. As a result of this change in belief, I began experiencing increased levels of internal anxiety regarding the possible outcomes for our planet and our way of life. I take it very seriously that we might have done too little too late regarding this situation. My distress only increases when the issue became political, stopping any agreement to address this serious issue. I am suffering deeply about the thought of leaving this horrendous problem to future generations, especially my children and grandchildren. In order to deal with my frustration, anxiety, depression, and anger, I have had to take personal action to retain my sanity. So I am trying to focus on what I have control over. We installed solar with storage on our house. I donate my work experience to my community and local agencies by working toward the preservation and protection of land from unnecessary development. I volunteer at my church's food pantry. I take daily runs with my dog, interacting with the homeless and laborers to acknowledge their situation. I avoid the news, which either gets my hopes up or tears them down. I feel much better when I focus on the positive and avoid the negative.
Thank you, David. I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Chloe Rosen and Paula Wild. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. Special thanks to Jeannie Baldzikowski for audio production, to Jennifer Young for underwriting outreach, to Leslie Nielsen for community outreach, and to Izzy Weiss for marketing. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. We've got some good news to share. State of Mind now broadcasts and live streams twice every month. So to hear more conversations about mental health and wellness, join us on the first Sunday and the second Monday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here at K-Squid 90.7 FM. You can also listen to all the past episodes of this show or subscribe and get them delivered directly to your listening device on either Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or listen through your home smart speaker by saying, play State of Mind Podcast with Deborah Sloss on TuneIn. If you like what you're hearing on State of Mind, help us get the episodes heard by more listeners by leaving a rating and a review on any of the podcast services. Or you can submit your comments at the bottom of the post for any episode at ksqd.org. We also want to encourage you to check out our redesigned State of Mind program page at ksqd.org/State of Mind. The archive has been indexed, so if you're in any of the helping professions like a teacher, nurse, doctor, therapist, or coach, you can now browse all the titles by category to find just the topic you're interested in. It's our hope that these shows will be a free resource that you can share with your students, clients, or patients. And remember, every show has a curated resource list posted along with the episode. This is listener-supported community radio, KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.